Good morning. We have much to discuss with Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy. We're going to get right to it. The senator joins us from Washington. I want to start with a comment you made a week ago. You were on with Fox News Sunday, and you were talking about all these college protests that were so in the news over the past week. And you said that you were not criminally offended by peaceful protests. We saw police go in and clear campuses across the country over this past week, Senator. What's your message to those protesters? College protests for sure have been part of the fabric of our country, but this sort of changed a bit over the past week.
Well, listen, I think it's really important to call out violence and threats of violence, to call out hate speech when it happens. What I said last weekend was that there is obviously a long history of student activism and student protest. There is also, frankly, a long history of students engaging in multi-day protests. And so I guess to the extent that the protests remain peaceful and don't threaten the safety of students on campus, I don't know that you shouldn't be able to carve out space for a multi-day student protest on a public area of campus. But yes, several of these protests have crossed the line. I don't endorse the takeover of buildings, but I also don't want all of the focus on these campuses to distract us from what's happening abroad. And whether or not you agree with these students, there is a very legitimate debate to be had about whether it's in the United States' interest to continue to participate in a campaign that has killed almost 15,000 children in Gaza and has made terrorist groups stronger, not weaker, around the world. So I certainly draw the line. Violence, threats of violence, compromising student safety. But I also want to make sure that the conversation isn't only about the conduct of a handful of very irresponsible students. There are a lot of students who are out there protesting respectfully and peacefully, and the topic that they are talking about is a very important topic.
Well, and even some of those peaceful protesters, though, Senator, we had Jewish students on many of these campuses saying, even if it wasn't a violent protest, even if there weren't threats of violence towards us, we felt singled out, we felt targeted by the nature of the protest. Is that just part of what happens in a society like ours, or is that something that does concern you, that students also attending those schools who happen to be Jewish felt threatened?
Well, listen, I think every campus is different, so I can't broadly opine on the matter, and I certainly can't speak to an individual student who may have legitimately felt unsafe. But it is important to understand what anti-Semitism is and what it is not. It is not anti-Semitic to criticize the policy of the government of Israel. It is not anti-Semitic to protest against Israel's war in Gaza. You cross the line when you start to talk about violence towards the Jewish people. But I do want to be careful about understanding what speech is anti-Semitic and what speech is not, what speech is legitimately threatening, and what speech is simply uncomfortable.
You talked about it in your answer to the first question, but there is another issue outside of our borders, and that is what's happening in Gaza. What's the latest there, and where do you stand on next steps? Because it sounds like you do have some concerns about what's happened so far.
Well, we had a briefing from our intelligence community that told us the war in Gaza has become a generational recruiting moment for global terrorism. I don't understand why Israel has not learned from our mistakes in places like Afghanistan, where we thought that our military alone could destroy a terrorist group, when in fact we ended up making it stronger. That is likely what is happening in Gaza today, in addition to all of the civilians who are being killed. I think this needs to be a moment where Israel pauses the military campaign. I think this assault on Rafah that they are planning could be absolutely cataclysmic from a humanitarian standpoint. I think we need a long-term negotiated end to this conflict and a pathway for the Palestinians to have a state of their own. I don't want Hamas to ever have the ability to do this ever again, but I ultimately think that the way in which this campaign has been waged is possibly making it more likely, not less likely, that there will be a future terrorist attack on Israel and potentially against the United States.
The last time you were on this show, we talked about the holdup in Ukraine funding and it being tied up in other things, some things you were involved with, like border security. Ukraine has now gotten the funding that it had requested. Are you feeling confident that that's going to be enough to turn the tide in that war with Russia?
Well, we've lost a lot of time. I mean, by delaying funding for Ukraine, Republicans in Congress gave Russia the ability to go on the offense and gain some momentum. So, this was not too late but a lot of damage has been done. Listen, what I want to prevent is for American troops to be over in Europe fighting Russia directly. That would be a disaster, not just because of the cost for American lives, but also because you do not want two nuclear powers in direct conflict with each other. And the problem is, if Putin wins in Ukraine, it is very possible he's going to move on to another country that America has a treaty obligation to defend. So to me, this is just practical politics. This is a very cheap investment in our security because Ukraine is just asking for money. They are not asking for American troops or American lives. I'm glad the money's on its way, but I think time will tell whether it is going to allow Ukraine to make some big new major progress this year.
I want to, before we run out of time here, I want to ask about a couple of things you're working on that are pretty interesting. One is the Restoring the Common Good initiative with Governor Spencer Cox, a Republican from Utah. Tell us about that, if you would, Senator.
Yeah, as people in Connecticut know, I'm spending a lot of time these days working with Republicans, whether it be on guns or immigration. But I'm also trying to work with Republicans to ask some deeper questions about the real kind of emotional unhealth of this country. People are feeling anxious, unhappy. You see that in rising suicide rates, addiction rates, rising rates of political violence. Spencer Cox is a conservative governor from Utah, but he's about my age. He's got kids a little bit older than me. He cares about the future of this country, and he wants to find a way for Republicans and Democrats to talk better together about the crises that we are facing and try to find some ways to restore a value in the common good, a common good that includes both the left and the right. So I went out to Utah and launched a new initiative called Restoring the Common Good. And the design here is that Republicans and Democrats can sit down, talk about the ways that Americans are feeling anxious and unhappy, and see if there are some areas of agreement between the two parties that are outside of all of the typical dividing lines on immigration, abortion, healthcare. So we'll see what the fruit of this conversation is, but it's certainly part of my broader set of work to try to build some bridges with the Republicans.
Only about a minute left, but tell me about the Kids Off Social Media Act. I know a lot of our viewers are watching that, all this TikTok talk lately. Tell us about that initiative.
Real progress being made in the Senate to try to bring a kids' online safety debate before the Senate. As a parent of a teenager and a preteen, listen, I see the danger of these social media sites. Here's the thing I care most about: the algorithm that is addicting our kids, that's collecting their personal information and giving them really dangerous, often really damaging content. So the bill that I've introduced would say that algorithm can't turn on until you're 17 years old. If you're under 17, that algorithm is just potentially too dangerous, feeding you self-harm, eating disorder content within 10 minutes of signing up for a site. Hopefully we'll get this bill in front of the Senate.
When you look at some of the names on there, you talked about working with Republicans, people like Cruz and Fetterman and King and Warren. A lot of names on there that people will recognize, co-sponsors. We're just about out of time, but I can't let you go. You got a lot of attention during March Madness for openly tweeting about the UConn Huskies. People saying, wait, this is a U.S. Senator rooting on his team. So we've seen Dan Hurley in the transfer portal, Aiden Mahaney, Liam McNeely. It sounds a little bit like some kind of comedy set in Southie that maybe like Matt Damon and Ben Affleck are in. But what are your thoughts on what Hurley's doing? Are we going for a three-peat, or what do you think, Senator?
Yeah, I like wear this on my sleeve. I probably do put way too much UConn content on social media, but I'm so fired up about this team. They're going to be sick. I mean, McNeely is a stud. The guy they just brought in from St. Mary seems to be a perfect fit. I'm super excited that Diarra chose to come back, and we now just need to put the pressure on Caravan. If Caravan comes back, this is absolutely a three-peat team. So yes, I definitely get distracted from my work as a United States Senator through my desire to spend a lot of time following UConn, but I'm very much like many people in Connecticut in that way. We're excited.
Well, we've been talking about the news and about UConn for a lot of years together, so I wanted to make sure we had time to get that question. And you forgot about Terrace Reed coming over from Michigan. Put him with Samson Johnson, could be a big 1-2 punch there for the center.
And a new transfer coming onto the women's team too. That's gonna round out Gino's lineup. So we listen. We want 2 championships next year.
All right. Well, that's Sports Talk with Eric and Chris. Senator Murphy, thank you for being with us. We'll have you back on again.
Thanks.